Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Dead Guy Tools. This is the Arcane Knowledge version. What we got here is an old Amal carburetor float bowl. So these old Amal Concentrics were used on Triumphs up until the late 70s, and I fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the day, own a late 70s Triumph Bonneville and have been struggling with getting these the float levels set. So we're going to go through how to check the float level and then how to adjust it using these old style plastic floats without the adjustable stainless steel tabs. So we got the rod right here that holds the float in place, and onto that tab goes your float needle. Make sure it's got a Viton tip. If it doesn't have a Viton tip, throw yours away and order a new one. Those things are cheap and they last pretty much forever. So drop this guy into the float bowl like so. And now we're ready to do some measuring. So spec says you want 80 thousandths clearance between the float bowl and the edge, or the float and the edge of the float bowl. There's a couple of different ways to measure that. You can come across with feeler gauges like this, but that is assuming that from here to here is nice and square. And given that these things were made out of, I think, zinc pot metal, whatever it is, it's garbage. They're usually got a bit of wibble wobble in between the actual machine surfaces of the float. So what I'm using instead, if you focus, is an old Mitsutoyo depth mic. So this is a nice one. It's a dead guy tool. You can get these pretty cheap nowadays on Amazon or eBay or all the regular suspects. You can set that here. And what that does is I've got this already set to 75 thou. It's got this little pin sticking out. Makes this really easy. Put it on there, hold it nice and square, take a little screwdriver, go in between the float bar or float pin, then the float needle onto the plastic, just push down. And you can feel when that actually hits through the mic. So I set this one already at 75 thou. It's pretty damn good. One thing I do want to point out, you don't want to push too hard. You can see that float wiggling, and that's going to throw off all your measurements. So you just want to push down until you hit a stop and just hold it there. Alright guys, so this is the other float bowl from the Bonneville, and right away I already measured this. This thing comes in at over 150 thou. That is all the movement I'm getting on it, which is nowhere near right. I don't even know how this bike was running. But to actually adjust that, it's not like a modern carburetor where you can bend the tab and just bend it, set it, and forget about it. This is British. It's got to be backwards. So inside here is a small brass pin or brass sleeve, which the needle jet resides. To change that, you need to heat up the outside of the carburetor body with a torch and move it around with a drift. I can't make this shit up. This is so fucking backwards. It's hilarious. But we're going to heat this up. We're going to show you how to do it real quick and get this float where it's supposed to be. Alright, before we take a torch to the carburetor of our motorcycle, because that's how Britain worked, I want to show you this brass sleeve, which we'll be moving around to get the float level set. So hopefully you can see through that. There we go. So that hole is where your float needle sits and turns on or turns off your fuel. So you don't need to remove this completely when you're adjusting it, but I'm going to knock it out completely to show you guys what this thing looks like in case you accidentally do it and get scared. Alright, so now we're all set up to drive out this bushing. So to do that, you need a 1/8 inch roll pin and a little baby tink hammer. We're going to come in through here, tap this once the actual zinc body is hot, and it should pop right on out. Don't go nuts with it. Success! Got it out. So not much heat, just a little bit. Let's see where that sleeve ran off to. Alright, so that's it. Alright, now we're ready to drive this back in. So I like to use a brass drift if I can, and something that's larger than the ID of this sleeve so you're not damaging the taper that's ground into this brass float seat. So something like that. And heat up your carburetor. Just heat up your carburetor. Try to get it all the way around if you can. Go back and forth. Don't. I'm using the settling torch on this. This pot metal will turn into goo. Should be more than enough. Set it in. See how nice that slid? Alright. Now we got that driven down. Alright, so if you get inside of one of these float bowls and you find that a mechanic went through and put a chisel right into where that float seat or float needle is supposed to sit, and it's all, chowdered up and not making a good seal, there are two different approaches you can go to repairing that. First of which is using a center drill. This is a number 2. This fits in the hole really well, but you can see that it'll put a taper. And I've had float needles that were totally fine accepting a small taper, and I've had others that weren't. What I prefer to do is use a counter boring bit. So this has a small pin that registers inside the hole in that brass sleeve. And you can see that it's going to put a flat square face on it. These are a little hard to come by. I'm sure you could find one on Amazon. You certainly find one or set on Shars. But make some measurements and see what you need. Or, you can, I'm pretty sure, order this piece, this brass sleeve. It can't be expensive, and it's also not very hard to whip up on a lathe if you've got one. But, again, you can repair them. It works 50% of the time, if not a little bit less. One thing you want to check while you got the float bowl off is just how square the float bowl is. And by square, I mean dead flat to itself. So to do that, I've got a piece of scrap granite countertop. Well, it's actually not granite, it's a man-made composite, but whatever. You can use a big piece of plate glass. That'll work as well. So what I did here is I've got layout fluid all over the edge of the top edge of the float bowl. You can use Sharpie in a pinch if you don't have layout fluid. But you want to set this down using moderate pressure with your hands. Do a couple of figure 8s. I always like to flip it around just to make sure I'm not overloading one side. And take a look and see what you got. So right away, this is pretty common. You get bend at at where you have to have the screws. You're going through, you're torquing things down. This crappy zinc pot metal is going to bend like nothing. So, alright, a few ways to handle that. And there's some ways to handle that are better than others. Alright, so there's two main ways to deal with these bent tabs. And first and easiest is taking a file to them. You can do that, or you can bend these back. Personally, I like to make sure that the whole thing is square to itself. To do that, we're going to use some fine grit sandpaper. I think this is, 1200 maybe. And wet sand it. And put a little water on the bottom. A little water on top. And that's not tonic water, that's just what it happens to be in. And get it in. And now go do your figure 8s again. Terrible figure 8s, by the way. Alright, now, just after pretty brief time. You can see it's making that nice and smooth, and it looks like it's also taken down areas that were high that we didn't notice right away. And that still looks like it's going to be a bit high on this edge, so we're going to keep on going. And yes, this is removing a little bit of metal, but the amount that we're actually removing is quite low. And the rest of that really looks like it's in in the crappy casting of the actual float bowl. So I think I'm going to call it and say that I'm happy with that. Hopefully you can see that. But yeah, the rest of these, bring our little light over here. Those are actual just divots in the shitty casting. My God. Thanks, Amal. Alright, so both these ended up getting set about 75 thou. It's a little lower than what I wanted, but with an old bike, sometimes you got to take what you can get and be happy about it. Other than that, this is a pretty straightforward procedure. It's not that hard. Again, work slow. Don't use too much heat. You are heating a bowl that holds fuel, after all. And, as long as you pay attention to what you're doing, you ain't going to become a dead guy. All right. Thanks, guys.